Welcome into the ShopFix channel. In this episode, we're going to cover how to completely refinish a garage floor with an epoxy garage floor coating kit. If your garage needs a remodel like my dad's did, well, this video is going to come in great handy because for a few $100, you can turn an old garage into something amazing. In this video, I'm going to detail every step that I took to turn this old cracked garage into a DIY garage floor masterpiece. ShopFix, your free online source for everything DIY. Alright, so before we really get into anything here, we're going to have to clean all the debris that's collected within the garage. So I'm going to simply take a push broom here, sweep it into a pile, and then vacuum it up. And I would recommend doing this because if you try to blow all the debris out of your garage, you might miss a few spots just because of the weight of the debris, such as chipped concrete or small little rocks. We'll also take a vacuum and vacuum the crevices to remove all the debris from the large cracks. To continue this cleaning process, we're going to take a power washer with a thin spray nozzle and clean out those cracks even further. I highly recommend using a power washer for this initial step because it's going to get all the dirt and debris out of the cracks and start working some of that grease off of the surface of the concrete. At this point of the process, if you do have any heavy spots of grease, I will go ahead and get a degreasing solution and scrub that into the concrete surface to help work out those grease stains. To help the concrete dry faster, for the next step of the project, I would use a squeegee to remove any standing water. With the concrete now fully cleaned and degreased, we can mix the concrete and repair the large cracks. For the purpose of this video, we're using a product called Recap, which is a concrete resurfacer, but we're mixing it to a trowelable consistency so we can fill in those large cracks. It does take some time to apply the concrete, so make sure you mix it in small batches. The concrete surface of this garage is really uneven, so I'm using a small trowel so I can work along the unevenness of the concrete. Most of the cracks and the pitting that I repaired on this project were a ½ inch or larger, so I decided that this concrete was going to be the best solution. However, there are different products for thinner cracks that are much easier to apply. With larger cracks, like the ones that I'm dealing with here, mixing your own concrete to a trowelable consistency is going to be the most cost-effective solution and one of the best ways to repair cracks like these in my opinion. Once the repaired concrete had plenty of time to dry, I took a floor scraper and cleaned off any high spots in my repair. After brushing away all the debris left over from the repair and cleaning off the high spots, I took a power washer to finish the cleaning process. And again, using that squeegee to remove any standing water to allow the concrete to dry faster. With all those steps taken, we now have a cleaned and degreased concrete surface that's free from all large cracks. However, oftentimes garages just like this one have significant pitting along the surface, which is caused by salt deposits. To repair this significant pitting throughout the garage, we're going to be using self-leveling concrete resurfacer called Recap. Before putting down the Recap self-leveling concrete, we applied concrete primer to the surface of the garage. This concrete primer helps the new concrete bond to the old surface. With all those steps taken, now it's time to go ahead and finally mix the self-leveling Recap to a very thin consistency. To make this mixing process a lot easier and more consistent, we went ahead and weighed the concrete because we already knew the proper ratio to water, and this way we can easily add that exact amount of water every time. We also made it really easy to measure the volume of water by using a water bottle cut at the top. After you've added about the proper amount of water to concrete, you can go ahead and start mixing. To combine this mixture, you'll want to use a mixing paddle bit attached to a drill. You'll want to add water until you reach a very fluid consistency. Another thing to note here is you'll also want to keep mixing until there's no visible clumps within your mixture. Once your concrete mixture has reached a very thin, fluid consistency, we can begin applying the mixture in the areas in which we want to resurface. Initially, when I was pouring out this mixture onto the floor, I was just dumping it all in one spot and then thinning it out. However, I noticed that when I spread it out in the beginning of the pour, it was a lot easier to thin out in the areas that I needed it to be. Another thing I noticed when applying this thin set concrete is that to get a very smooth consistency just with a squeegee is actually really hard. So I would recommend coming back with a finishing trowel to make that surface a lot cleaner than what the squeegee can leave behind. The last tip that I mention here is that if you already use concrete primer, there's no need to wet the floor before you put down concrete resurfacer, because the primer is doing the same thing as wetting the concrete, which is making the concrete not porous anymore. After the concrete resurfacer has had plenty of time to dry, you can take a 20 grit concrete rub brick and actually smooth out any high spots or rough spots along your new concrete surface. To remove any leftover dust or debris from this repair process, I'm going to go ahead and power wash the floor once again. The last step that we need to take before applying the epoxy is to etch the concrete surface, and this roughs up the concrete enough so the epoxy can adhere to the surface. If you purchase a Rust-Oleum garage floor epoxy kit, this clean and etch solution is included. However, if you're using a different epoxy, Rust-Oleum still makes the clean and etch solution in a pre-mixed formula. To apply the etching solution, first you're going to want to pre-wet the concrete. Afterwards, you can apply the etching solution from your watering can, making sure to sprinkle it evenly over the surface. Next, you'll want to make sure to thoroughly scrub the solution into the concrete, and then finish the process by rinsing the solution away. Simply repeat this etching process over the entire length of your garage. Ensure the concrete now has about a 150 grit sandpaper texture before proceeding. Well, now it's time to break out our DIY epoxy kit by Rust-Oleum called EpoxyShield. To activate the epoxy, you simply need to roll part B into part A and it will release the seal that keeps them separated. Then you can simply mix them in the bag. You'll want to make sure that you mix for 2 to 3 minutes very thoroughly and get all corners of the bag. To be able to pour this mixture, you simply need to cut one corner of the bag. To make rolling on the epoxy a lot easier, first we're going to pour some of the mixture into small cups, and then we're going to use that to trim in the edges of the concrete. Make sure to keep the bag in an upright position so the epoxy doesn't pour out onto the floor. Now we can start trimming in the edges, and I recommend using painter's tape where it's kind of hard to actually make a nice edge, especially at the front of your garage. On the sides here, it's fairly easy to trim in if you're familiar with painting. Now we have the entire edge of this garage floor trimmed in with our epoxy, and that's going to make it much easier to roll the rest of this epoxy on this garage floor. Now it's time to pour the entire contents of the first bag into painting trays. I recommend splitting the mixture into 2 painting trays and actually having 2 people roll this on, one on the left side of the garage and one on the right side of the garage. And this is going to make it to where you don't get any lap lines because that epoxy doesn't have too much time to dry. Alright, let's start rolling on this epoxy. One thing I would note here is that you're going to want to check your dry times for the epoxy solution. If you're working in warmer weather, like 80 degrees, this epoxy is going to dry a lot faster and you're going to have to work faster to put it on. Once you've applied the epoxy in about a 4-foot section, I would begin decorating with the flakes. Adding the flakes on top of your epoxy solution isn't a required step, however, I think adding the flakes makes the texture and the look so much better. Once you've reached the desired texture with your flakes, you can move on to the next 4-foot section of epoxy. Again, once the epoxy is applied in a 4-foot section, I would begin to decorate with your flakes, reaching the desired texture and making sure the flakes are evenly distributed over the surface. Once you've reached the midpoint of your garage, you'll likely need the second bag of epoxy, and we're going to mix it the same way as we mixed the first bag, making sure to mix the epoxy thoroughly for 2 to 3 minutes. If possible, during this time, you can have the other person roll on a fresh edge so you don't get any lap lines. Now we can go ahead and fill up our paint trays with the second bag of epoxy. With the second bag of epoxy mixed and in our paint trays, we can go ahead and roll the rest of the epoxy on to our garage floor. When working in these 4-foot sections, I recommend overlapping your edge so that the flakes have a wet surface to adhere to. I'd also recommend, once you get to the edge of your garage, to use a plastic sheet over your driveway so you don't get any epoxy drips on it. Next, we'll fully complete the flake texture all the way to the edge of the garage. Now that all the epoxy has been rolled on and the desired texture with the flakes has been achieved, I'm going to remove the painter's tape to reveal a nice clean edge. So this is what the garage looked like immediately after applying all the epoxy and the flakes to the garage floor. Once the epoxy has fully dried, we're going to go ahead and sweep up any loose flakes that didn't adhere to the epoxy. Not required, but highly recommended, we're going to be using the Clear Epoxy Topcoat by Rust-Oleum. The Rust-Oleum EpoxyShield Clear Topcoat works similarly to that of the EpoxyShield Garage Floor Coating Kit, and the bags of epoxy are mixed in the exact same manner. The reason we decided to use the EpoxyShield Clear Topcoat was to add a layer of strength to our epoxy floor and also to increase the glossiness of the surface. So after mixing the two-part epoxy solution together and pouring it into my paint tray, I began to roll the mixture on in 4-foot by 4-foot sections. We noticed that varying the angle in which the clear top coat was applied made it look a lot better. I simply repeated this process with every 4-foot by 4-foot section of the garage. Overall, we were pretty impressed with how this clear top coat came out and how glossy it was. At this point, the garage floor was looking absolutely incredible, but then we added some gray paint to the concrete foundation and to the walls, and this is how it turned out. Well, that about wraps up this DIY epoxy garage floor project. If you've enjoyed this video, a thumbs up would be greatly appreciated, and if this is your first time checking out the ShopFix channel, consider subscribing today.